It appears that during the height of the Black Lives Matter protests after the death of George Floyd, President Donald Trump tried to use the military to crack down. So he wanted to order the military to go out there and basically crack the skulls of peaceful protesters because he didn't like them. Oh, okay. Well, that's great. Now, according to a report from Jonathan Swan of Axios, at the height of these protests, and look, we already knew about that. We knew that Donald Trump wanted to crack people's heads as long as they're black. He had no patience for that. Now, during that time, according to Swan, Donald Trump got into a shouting match with one of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This is General Mark Milley over the use of military in the streets. So now, and we've had this conversation about the Insurrection Act, and that's what this is based off of. All right, so Donald Trump wanted to use the Insurrection Act to call in the military to break up the George Floyd protests, which were overwhelmingly peaceful. It would have been a disastrous thing, a disastrous idea. It would have gone 100% against freedom and the First Amendment. And so everybody was like, no, don't do that. No Insurrection Act. We don't even know that it would be legal. Very likely that it would not be legal. So for the love of God, don't do it. Now, that doesn't stop Donald Trump, of course, from at least trying to do this. And I'll say one good thing about Donald Trump is that he tends to get on this idea and then forget about it like 5 minutes later. And so that was the situation with a lot of things. And at the end of the day, of course, we know he didn't actually do the Insurrection Act, but he was certainly trying to. So now the Insurrection Act, of course, of 1807 is a United States federal law that empowers the President of the United States to deploy U.S. military and federalized National Guards troops within the United States in particular circumstances, such as to suppress civil disorder, insurrection, or rebellion. It's weird. It almost could have been like it could have been used on January 6th, almost, right? Because that was a bit of an insurrection. Anyway, the reason they, of course, couldn't use it during the Black Lives Matter protests of the death of George Floyd is because protest is protected by the First Amendment. The protests are not rebellion. It is not insurrection. It's not even civil disorder. But let me get let me get to the argument here that he had with General Mark Milley. Now, this is a quote from a book, Frankly, We Did Win the Election, by the Wall Street Journal's Michael Bender. Trump's blowout with the general included an exchange where the former president yelled at General Milley. Swan reports the exchange, who wrote, quote, privately, Milley confronted Trump about his role. He was an advisor and not in command, but Trump had enough. Language warning, quote, I said you're in fucking charge. Well, I'm not in charge, Milley yelled back. You can't fucking talk to me like that. God damn it. That would have been my response. There's a room full of lawyers here. Will someone inform him of my legal responsibilities? You know who did? William Barr, Attorney General, who said, quote, he's right, Mr. President. The general is right. Imagine Donald Trump being wrong about something. Wow. I know nobody could have ever seen it coming. Nobody could have known that as president, you can't just order the military around for no reason because you don't like protest. Yeah. Now, that said, Trump's spokesperson comes out after this report goes out and basically says this, quote, this is totally fake news. It never happened. I'm not a fan of General Milley, but I never had an argument with him, and the whole thing is false. He never talked back to me. Michael Bender never asked me about it, and it's totally fake news. Is it, though? Again, I'm going to go back to reports here from June 2nd, where the president did want to use the military. This is June 2nd, 2020. President Trump had threatened to deploy active duty troops in American cities if states refused to make full use of the National Guard. a move that would dramatically escalate the federal response to the violent protests that have erupted nationwide since the death of an African American in police custody in Minneapolis last week. Our colleague Laurel Siegelman reported back then. So now, violent protests. Well, I'm going to show you how violent they actually were. But here's what he said at the time. I will deploy the U.S. military and quickly solve the problem for them. I am your president of law and order. Law and order. Again, this was before January 6th happened. But you can't, I mean, obviously with the power of hindsight, you really can't say that he's the president of law and order when he literally tried to incite an insurrection. Just saying. Now, a major question, according to the article, remains whether Trump had the power to deploy federal troops without requests from state governors, some of whom immediately expressed reservations. The last time the Insurrection Act was invoked was to quell riots in LA in 1992 after a request by then Governor Pete Wilson. Now, let's apply that, of course, to the George Floyd protests. How much of it was actually violent? Well, it turns out very, very, very small amounts of the protests were actually violent. Actually, according to a report by the U.S. Crisis Project, a joint effort by the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project and the Bridging Divides Initiative at Princeton, which collects and analyzes real-time data, demonstrations, and political violence in the United States, 93% of the racial justice protests in the U.S. since the death of George Floyd have been peaceful and non-destructive. 93%. The data reveals that the United States is in crisis, the report's authors wrote. It faces a multitude of concurrent overlapping risks, from police abuse and racial injustice to pandemic-related unrest and beyond, all exacerbated by increasing polarization. So it's not the George Floyd protests or the protesters that was the problem. It actually tends to be police, as well as polarization, political polarization, especially in the right wing, which, of course, you know, most of the violent attacks on American citizens actually come from the far right. And, of course, police. In fact, despite the peaceful nature of a majority of the Black Lives Matter protests, the authors note that the authorities intervened at about 9% of them, or nearly 1 in 10. 3% of all other demonstrations, which include the unrest over COVID-19 pandemic, were met with government intervention, the report states. When authorities intervened, they used force such as tear gas, rubber bullets, pepper spray, and more than half of those demonstrations, according to the report, more than 5% of protests linked to the Black Lives Matter movement were met with force by authorities, compared to only 1% of other demonstrations, the authors wrote. That use of force by authorities in some instances escalated tensions and increased the risk of violence, such as in places like Seattle and Portland. For example, the authors noted that violent demonstrations in Portland increased from 53% to 62% of all protests after federal agents arrived on the scene. So, it turns out Donald Trump almost made it worse. Because every time you had an increase in police and presence, in law enforcement presence, it actually got worse. It actually got more violent. Prior to the deployment, over 83% of demonstrations in Oregon were nonviolent. Post-deployment, the percentage of violent demonstrations had risen from under 17% to over 42%, suggesting that the federal response had only aggravated unrest. Gee, I wonder why. And yet again, this is what the right wing does. In any sort of protest, in any sort of dissent, their immediate reaction is to send in the troops, send in the cops, bust their heads. Unless, of course, and let me make a distinction here. Anytime a protest has to do with fighting injustice, fighting against racism, against some sort of inequities, or even movements like Occupy Wall Street, anything that makes the people in power uncomfortable, well, then that, of course, has to get crushed. But when it comes to, like, you know, people that were against pandemic mask mandates and business shutdowns, never had a police presence. Very, very rarely had a police there, and they never had to go and intervene. But try to do a Black Lives Matter protest, well, the cops are everywhere. Just saying. So whether or not this exchange happened or was fake news, there's no doubt that Donald Trump is an authoritarian. He definitely has authoritarian tendencies, and nearly made the situation, the George Floyd protests, much, much worse for the people who are protesting. And so, thankfully, he did not use the Insurrection Act, because things would have gotten way worse. If you enjoyed this video, please give us a like and share with your friends. You can subscribe and help out the channel by becoming a patron. It's patreon.com/Jeff Waldorf, or you can become a channel member as well by hitting the join button below.